New discoveries provide overwhelming evidence as to where the original temple Solomon built was located. This evidence can be found on the Temple Mount. In this video, we will be taking you on a unique journey as we reveal the evidence. This evidence is supported by the Bible, archaeology, and historical eyewitness accounts. However, over the past 25 years or so, there has been a growing number of people who are going against this 3,000-year-old tradition and are promoting the belief that the original temple was located in the city of David, and the Temple Mount was a Roman fort called the Antonia fortress, which housed a Roman legion of soldiers. We will answer their claims with facts that will leave no doubt as to where the original temple once stood. We will show the overwhelming evidence that the original temple was on the current Temple Mount by dividing this video into 3 segments. We will show evidence from archaeology, the Bible, and historical writings and eyewitness accounts. So climb aboard and stay tuned and see for yourself the evidence that clearly shows where the temple was truly located. Now, why is the location of the temple so important? Well, I'll give you 3 reasons. 1, there is no place in history that has played such a key role as the temple location. From Genesis 22 to Revelation 20, the role of the temple has been important. God has chosen to dwell there in a unique way and has future plans for the Temple Mount during the tribulation period. And Christ will reign from there during the millennial reign of Christ as well. 2, it removes the right the Jews have to the Temple Mount and actually supports their enemies. There is a massive movement underway to erase any history the Jews have to Israel and the Temple Mount. So this does not help the Jews in any way. And 3, there is also the idea that if the temple is located where the Dome of the Rock is, that it will be virtually impossible to build a new temple there as prophesied. But if it's in the city of David, they could start tomorrow. By locating the original temple in the city of David, this would move up God's timetable for end-time events. However, God doesn't need any help from us, as He is a God of miracles. In fact, He delights in taking what seems impossible and making it possible. By doing so, He receives all the credit and glory. Now let's start with the location of this site, and I must tell you that I am really excited to share with you some archaeological discoveries that reveal the location of Solomon, Zerubbabel, and Hezekiah's original temple and temple platform, along with the expansion of the Hasmonean and Herod the Great's Temple Mount platform. Now, when we refer to the Temple Mount platform, what we mean is the square, box-like shape upon which the temple was built. We must understand that the temple was built upon Mount Moriah, of which we'll talk more in a bit. In order to build a structure upon the top of the mountain, a large foundation needed to be built first. It is this foundation that is referred to as the Temple Mount platform. So now let's look at some amazing evidence that shows us the exact location of the original Temple Mount platform and its expansions by the Hasmoneans and Herod the Great. We begin at the northwest corner of the platform that was built in 691 AD by the Muslims, upon which they built the Dome of the Rock. And you can see this platform here today. This platform was not part of the original Temple Mount platform and was added specifically for the Dome of the Rock. It has 8 stairways leading up to this platform, and each stairway has arches at the top of the stairway. All these stairways are perfectly aligned with the platform except the northwest stairway. Interestingly, it is not aligned with the platform at all, but instead is aligned with the eastern wall of the Temple Mount platform. Also, what is really fascinating about this stairway is the bottom step. It is made up of large stones that are completely different from the others. These stones are from an entirely different time period and are much larger than any stones on this stairway. This is evidenced by what is called the boss outline of the stones. A boss is the carved outline around the edge of a stone that is cut away to give it a more pleasing and aesthetic look. Today, the boss of these stones has been filled in by a new layer of tiles. However, we have photos from 1972 that show the boss of these stones. Over the centuries, different kinds of boss shapes were used in different periods. For example, the boss shapes during Solomon, Hezekiah, Ezra, Hasmonean, and Herodian periods all have their unique shapes. The boss shape of these stones on the bottom step of this northwest stairway is from Solomon or Hezekiah's period. These stones are also close to the bedrock of Mount Moriah, which is the mountain upon which God ordered Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, upon which David built an altar, and upon which the original temple was built. These stones strongly suggest that they formed part of the original Temple Mount platform of Solomon or Hezekiah's time. Also, at the north end of these stones that make up the first step of this stairway, a corner is formed. A corner can be seen which goes eastward toward the eastern wall. Well, I wanted to point out some stuff to you. This is absolutely amazing. This right here is the corner of the original platform during Solomon's time, Hezekiah's time, that original platform. So right here is the line, and it runs now where the edge of the Muslim Temple Mount. So they built another platform up here, the Muslims, in around the latter 600 AD, 700 AD in that time. So anyway, they follow this same line here, but this line here will show you is an entirely different angle. So the angle of these stones and the platform of the Muslims is different. Okay, so we can identify this as the corner of the original platform of Solomon. Then from here, we can follow the line of the platform that exists now to the eastern gate, and we have markers there on the eastern gate just north of that. We can see a change in the stones there. So we know that this is the north part of the platform. We know that this right here was the west side of the platform, and we know where the eastern side is because we have stones there down below or down by the eastern gate that are from the time of Solomon, Hezekiah, that time as well. Then we can also see the platform on the south side. So unbelievable that here we are right here. These are original stones. These stones would have seen the prophets, they would have seen Solomon, they would have seen Jesus. Unbelievable that we're right here on these original stones from the time of Solomon in the original Temple Mount platform. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Now at this point, I'd like to introduce you to a couple leading archaeologists. One is Lane Rittmeyer, who has worked as an archaeologist on this Temple Mount for around 50 years, and he is considered the leading expert. Another is Joel Kramer. These are both leading archaeologists, and much of this information that we are using, we want to give credit to Lane Rittmeyer for his discoveries. So now I want you to hear what Joel Kramer says about these steps and this corner section here.
But anyways, I know Lane has continued digging here and in Jordan as well, and he serves as architect. So he points out, he really is the expert on the temple, and I do highly recommend his material. And so he points out this wall line right here. Now remember, when you're looking at walls or masonry, you see them from different periods. Do you see how different these stones are, right on this line right here than the other ones?
Yeah.
These are very old. And so he has identified this as a wall line from Solomon's temple. Okay.
Now, according to the Mishnah, which is Jewish writings about different aspects of Jewish laws, customs, measurements, and so forth, it tells us that the original Temple Mount platform measured 500 cubits square. Using the royal cubit, which was the universal measurement of these times, it would be 861 feet or 262.4 meters in length. Amazingly, the measurement from the corner of this pre-Herodian stone step is exactly 861 feet or 262.4 meters to the eastern wall. So it fits perfectly to be the northern wall of the original Temple Mount platform. This northern edge of the original Temple Mount platform also is in line with the current Dome of the Rock platform. Additional evidence of a pre-Herodian wall can be found underground as well by Cistern 29. There is a rock carving where you can see underground the face of this wall. Now, considering these factors, we now have strong evidence of where the northern wall of the 500 cubit Temple Mount platform is. Next, we come to the eastern wall. Just north of where the northern wall of the 500 cubit Mount platform meets the eastern wall, we find an offset in the wall located 68 feet or 20.73 meters north to this intersection. This offset reveals that there was once a tower at this corner for protection purposes. Well, welcome to the Holy Land and this biblical site of the eastern wall of the Temple Mount platform. This is very, very special. The eastern gate is very, very unique. It's the gate that Christ came through after the triumphal entry, came through it repeatedly. The Temple Mount sat right up above where the Dome of the Rock sits today. It is absolutely very, very special to be here. There are ancient stones here that date back to the time of Solomon. So what we're looking at on this eastern wall here is we're looking at the original Temple Mount platform that Solomon built, and then later would be fortified by Hezekiah, Nehemiah, and then down through the years. So we're looking at this eastern side of the Temple Mount. Well, now we're going to show you the original corner of the Temple Mount that Solomon would have constructed. How do we know that? We can see the corner and the setback in the wall. So the wall changes, these old stones change, and we can see a corner. So I'm going to walk up here and show you this, and we're going to move the camera around where you can see it as well. So right up here we can see a setback in a corner in these stones and how they change. So as the camera walks around here, you'll be able to see that there's a difference in the way these stones, they change, and that now there's a corner here that is different than the other. So we can tell that this is the corner of the original temple that Solomon built. Absolutely unbelievable. We also see by this eastern gate area ancient stones with the kind of boss shapes that go back to Solomon or Hezekiah's period. So the original eastern gate was built by Solomon or at a later date by Hezekiah. We don't exactly know for certain, but it dates back to this early First Temple period, we call it. Now there's ancient posts located inside this eastern gate today, along with the stones beside the gate of the eastern wall that date back to this First Temple period or this time of Solomon and Hezekiah. And so this affirms that the eastern gate had an early existence and that its location is at this exact present-day site. Then we know that Nehemiah rebuilt the eastern gate when he rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem in 444 BC. Now some believe the original gate was then named the Eastern Gate by Nehemiah at this time. Then later, Herod the Great rebuilt the eastern gate in around 19 BC and added a stairway, or rebuilt an existing one that led up to this eastern gate. Now this stairway ran alongside the eastern wall. It should be mentioned that the eastern wall location was never changed during the entire history of the Temple Mount. It was just added onto and repaired. This is so because of the Kidron Valley and its steep decline on this side. So again, these ancient stones reveal that the eastern side of the 500 cubit Temple Mount platform dates back to the time of Solomon or Hezekiah. Now we're going to show you some more of these original stones, these Solomonic stones. I'm going to show you why we know that once again. You can see they're just massive in size. You can see the bezel here, the way this sticks out, the way this is carved back in. It's kind of rustic. It's not like the Herodian stones, which were very smooth. These are old, and they were more rustic in the way that they chiseled them out. See over here the same thing. This is what's called the boss right here. So the stone, you have this, and then the stone sticks out to give it some design and some nice look. So anyway, we can tell that these are old stones from the time of Solomon, Hezekiah, Nehemiah, back in the first temple period, and then at the beginning of the second period. In fact, these stones have been here ever since Solomon originally laid them for the original Temple Mount. So amazing to think about this. Amazing to look at these stones. They're just massive here. And you can see up above, they're going to change. These were added on later. But these lower ones that are massive in size, that are older and have this type of boss, these are from the time dating back to Solomon and that period back there. So absolutely amazing to look at this and just to be here and see this. Unbelievable. Now, measuring from this intersection where the northern wall meets the eastern wall, we see a curious bend in the wall at exactly 861 feet or 262 meters. So the eastern side from the intersection of the northern wall, measuring 861 feet or 262.4 meters, we come to a curious bend in the wall. This bend in the wall is the result of later construction that was added onto the 500 cubit Temple Mount platform during the Hasmonean period in around 164 BC. The Hasmonean period briefly was when the Jews reconquered their land and took control back of the temple and Jerusalem. Now, their construction used a slightly different angle than the original platform did. Also, there is a change in the stone style. The stones after the bend have a boss shape that dates to the Hasmonean period. The stone positioning and configurations also indicate a corner was once located at this bend in the wall. This archaeological evidence reveals that this point was the corner of the original 500 cubit Temple Mount platform. Again, this section of the eastern wall measures exactly 861 feet or 262.4 meters, which is 500 cubits. Next, we'll look at the southern wall of the original 500 cubit Temple Mount platform, measuring 853 feet or 260 meters from the southeast corner of the original 500 cubit Temple Mount platform, which has the bend in the wall. We come to the entrance of Barclay's Gate. This gate was built later by Herod and was butted up against the southern wall of the original 500 cubit Temple Mount platform. Now, this slightly different measurement of 853 feet or 260 meters amounts to less than 1% and was probably the result that the two corners could not be seen due to the elevation of Mount Moriah that was between them. So once again, this is a very slight variation. The western wall section of the original 500-cubit Temple Mount platform can be located by establishing the corners of the northwest and southwest corners, and this measures exactly 861 feet or 262.4 meters. Additional evidence can be seen by a gate called Warren's Gate that can be found butted up against the original 500-cubit Temple Mount platform. And miraculously, like I say, we can see from here 861 feet to that setback. Then from that setback going that way to the bend in the wall, 861 feet. From here down there, 861 feet. And then from that point to over here, it's 853 feet, less than 1% difference, but they believe that's due to that Mount Moriah was like this, and they maybe had a hard time seeing each other when they built that down there. So in summary, we see overwhelming evidence of the original 500-cubit square Temple Mount platform. It should be noted that we can also see the evidence of the Hasmonean and Herodian additions to the original 500-cubit Temple Mount platform as well. In around 141 BC, as we've mentioned, the Hasmoneans added a section to the southern part of the original 500-cubit Temple Mount platform. Again, this can be seen in the bend in the eastern wall and the different stone styles used. Sometime later, in around 19 BC, Herod the Great embarked on a massive expansion of the Temple Mount platform. Josephus, a Jewish historian living around the time of Christ, speaks of how he doubled the size of what the Temple Mount was after the Hasmonean expansion. He enlarged it to the south, west, and north. Today we see this evidence all throughout the expansion sections. One key place is the expansion of the southern part of the eastern wall. There is a notable seam in the wall that reveals Herod's expansion, which was added onto the Hasmonean expansion. This seam clearly shows the change from the Hasmonean to Herodian stone styles. The location and configurations between the Hasmonean and Herodian stones show this was once a corner. Also, the Herodian stones along the western wall section speak of Herod's expansion on this side. Additionally, at the northern wall of the Temple Mount are holes in the wall that show where a portico was once located. Again, the eastern wall of the original 500-cubit Temple Mount platform was never changed. It was just added onto and repaired. And we know that the eastern wall was never changed because we see these original ancient stones dating back to Solomon and Hezekiah and this time period. Again, it was repaired and added onto it. And that's why stones above on the eastern wall are different in style, smaller in shape than the ones down at the base. Lastly, the location of the original temples can also be established with certainty. Inside the Dome of the Rock is the highest point of Mount Moriah. On this massive stone, we can see a cutout square that once housed the Ark of the Covenant, and its measurements are the exact size of the Ark of the Covenant. And to the sides of this square, the foundation of the Holy of Holies can be seen. It should be noted that the altar that David purchased from Araunah the Jebusite was just east of the top of the mountain in a flatter area. So it was just down below where the high point of Mount Moriah was, where the Holy of Holies was. Here you can see where the altar would have been located in relation to the rock inside the Dome of the Rock. So what we see today is the Dome of the Rock built over the original place where the temple once stood. The very name, Dome of the Rock, means just that, the rock upon which the original temple was located. In fact, in 638 AD, after the Muslims conquered Jerusalem, Caliph Umar wanted to build a shrine honoring Allah, the God of the Muslims. He wanted to build it over the place the temple once stood. Sophronius, the bishop of Jerusalem at that time said to him, "It is the rock. It is the center of the world and was a temple for the Israelites, who held it in great veneration, and wherever they were, they turned their faces toward it during prayer." So the dome of the rock was then built over the exact place the temple once stood and has remained there to this day, which is around 1,300 years. So all of this evidence just reveals the location of the original Temple Mount platform, and then the temple that Solomon built, and then Zerubbabel built, and then Herod the Great renovated. Now, what we can clearly conclude from all this evidence is that the Temple Mount platform that we see today existed long before the Romans arrived. It was not built by Herod the Great for the Romans as a fort. To say that the current Temple Mount was a Roman fort is to overlook and deny all this archaeological and historical evidence. With all due respect, this is very unfortunate and irresponsible. Now let's look at more evidence that proves the current Temple Mount is the true location of the original temples that once stood upon it. Now it would be good to mention at this point that no licensed archaeologist in Israel believes the temple was in the city of David and the Temple Mount was a Roman fort. Those who believe otherwise are not archaeologists. We begin with an amazing discovery called the Trumpeter's Stone. This was located on the southwest corner of the current Temple Mount. Well, here we are at a very special place. This is a replica, but the original is just exactly like it. When Israel does these replicas, they do them just, you can't tell the difference. But anyway, this is a replica. The real one is in the Israel Museum, but this was positioned up on top of the corner up here. You can see a picture of it right here, but what it says right here in Hebrew, and it can still be read today in Hebrew, it says to the place of the trumpeting two. So what this did is this is where the trumpeter would come to, and it would announce to the shops and everything right here that the Sabbath was coming or holy days. So it was a way to announce to the people. There were shops all along here. There's a street right here that will show you that was crushed. But anyway, it says to the trumpeters, it was an announcement so that the people would know that it's time to shut things down. It's time to get ready for the Sabbath or feast or whatever holy days or weeks that they were celebrating. So amazing evidence. This was recently discovered, buried here among all these other stones. This was all excavated. It was all underground for many years, and then when Israel became a nation, they began to excavate here and uncover all this. But evidence that the temple was right here, right up here, will show you is an arch that came up, is stairways that came up right here, and then there were stairways that came down from the pool of Siloam that came up. So this was a major entrance right here onto the Temple Mount, along with the southern stairs and other places as well. But anyway, amazing, amazing stone right here. Just really, really unique to see this. Now Josephus, a Jewish historian writing during the 1st century AD, writes about a trumpeter's place on the southwest corner of the current Temple Mount. So this all matches perfectly. Now this trumpeter's stone that fell down from the southwest corner of the current Temple Mount provides more evidence that the Temple Mount we see today is the true location of the original temples. Well, just up from this trumpeter's stone here, we can see the old Herodian street here, okay? And so when these massive rocks, you can see them up here, these massive building blocks, when they fell down, they were so heavy. When the Romans conquered the city and knocked them down, they were so heavy that they just absolutely crushed the city street here. And of course, this was all excavated and all of this was uncovered. Right up here, once again, was Robinson's Arch, where pilgrims would come in from the pool of Siloam or wherever. So amazing. Right behind me are shops. This was a very, very busy area during the time of the Jews, time of Christ. Christ would have walked up these stairs. Christ would have walked on this street right here. So absolutely amazing to see this, and just to see the evidence of the destruction of the temple and the Temple Mount platform. Now, I just also want to point out that much of the wall was left intact, okay? Some of the base of the Temple Mount platform was left intact because when the stones fell down, they reached an equilibrium, so the stones couldn't fall farther than what the ones that were already there. So they fell down, and that was underneath it, they fell down and covered, then that was preserved still intact. So just amazing to see these stones. Some of these stones are just absolutely massive in size, huge, and finely cut, so finely cut that you can't even hardly slip a credit card in between some of these cracks. The precision was absolutely amazing. Now, if the current Temple Mount was a Roman fort, as some claim, then why would the Romans destroy their own fort? It makes no sense whatsoever. It should also be mentioned at this point that in this area of destruction, a pomegranate-shaped golden bell the priest would have used at the bottom of their garments has been found, along with a Jewish ritual purity token and an etching of a menorah that have all been found right here together at the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. These all attest to the current Temple Mount being the true location of the original temples. Now let's look at more evidence on the current Temple Mount that shows why it's the true location of the original temples. Peretz Reuven published a groundbreaking article in Biblical Archaeology Society in 2015, wherein he has proven that some of the beams of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is on the Temple Mount, date back to 2,000 to even 3,000 years old. Some of them have Islamic inscriptions written on them in Arabic that even indicate they were used and came from the original temples. Peretz Reuven also recently published an article about a recent discovery in Hebron of a mosque with an Arabic inscription dating to the 8th century AD, saying that the Dome of the Rock is at the site where the temple once stood. More evidence can be found from what is called the Sifting project. In 1999, the Muslims conducted illegal renovations on the Temple Mount and disposed of over 9,000 tons of dirt mixed with invaluable architectural artifacts into the Kidron Valley. What appeared to be wrong turned out to be miraculous. All this material from the Temple Mount is being sifted, and unbelievable discoveries are being made that confirms the Temple Mount is the true location of the original temples. Among these discoveries are thousands of tile fragments that form the ancient tile floor of much of the Temple Mount, dating back to the First and Second Temple periods. These tiles were also written about and recorded by Josephus. Every bucket of earth that is sifted contains fragments of pottery, glass vessels, metal objects, bones, worked stones, and mosaic tesserae stones. These are the most frequent finds from the Temple Mount. The finds are dated mainly to the First Temple period and onwards from the 10th century BC till today. There are some finds from earlier periods, but they are scarce. In addition to these general categories, there are numerous finds of many kinds, such as fragments of stone vessels, approximately 5,000 ancient coins, various pieces of jewelry, a rich assortment of beads, terracotta figurines, arrowheads and other weaponry, weights, items of clothing, game pieces and dice, bone and shell inlays, furniture decorations, ornaments, bone tools, and so forth. Fragments of elaborate architectural members from the buildings, among them pillars, mosaic floors, colored wall plaster, and glazed wall tiles. All of these discoveries prove overwhelmingly that the current Temple Mount is the true location of the original temples, and that the Temple Mount existed long before the Romans arrived. Therefore, there is no way the Temple Mount could have been built for the Romans as a fort. Other important discoveries include finding 2 warning inscriptions forbidding Gentiles to enter the inner court of the temple. One was found by the Lion's Gate, also called Stephen's Gate, and the other in the northern part of the Temple Mount. These reveal further evidence that the current Temple Mount is the true location of the original temples. Now would be a good time to deal with the claims by some that the current Temple Mount was a Roman fort. The main argument they use is that the traditional site of the Antonia fortress was too small to house a legion of soldiers. However, their claim is not based on historical facts. During the time of Christ and leading up to the Jewish revolt in 66 AD, there was never a Roman legion in Jerusalem. In 66 AD, the Jews revolted against the Romans and took over the Antonia fortress, which was on the northwest corner of the Temple Mount. As a result, Roman legions were sent to stomp out this rebellion. The Romans would wind up conquering Jerusalem in 70 AD under the Roman general Titus. The historian Josephus writes that in this destruction, the Romans destroyed the Antonia fortress in several days. A simple Google search will reveal these facts. Therefore, there was never a Roman legion in Jerusalem during the time of Christ leading up to 66 AD. Therefore, the claim that the Temple Mount was a Roman fort is not accurate at all. Now, there was a cohort of around 500 or so Roman soldiers stationed at the Antonia fortress on the northwest corner of the Temple Mount, and then more at Herod's palace by the Jaffa Gate. There could also have been Roman soldiers in encampments around Jerusalem, as was their custom. An example of this can be seen at Masada. As mentioned earlier, it would make no sense that if the Temple Mount was a Roman fort and a legion was stationed there, that the Romans would destroy their own fort. Also, if a Roman legion would have been at the so-called Roman fort on the Temple Mount, the Jews wouldn't have stood a chance and been able to rebel against the Romans in 66 AD and drive out the Roman soldiers from the Roman fort. Now, some will claim that the mention of a quote by Josephus when referring to the Antonia fortress indicates it was very large. Here's the quote from Josephus. By having all conveniences that cities wanted, it might seem to be composed of several cities, but by its magnificence it seemed a palace. However, in the same description, he continues and says, and as the entire structure resembled that of a tower, it contained also 4 other distinct towers at its 4 corners. So his description is a little confusing. On one hand, the Antonia fortress seems large, but then at the same time, it seems smaller and resembles a tower, and also he uses the description of a palace. A city cannot be just a tower or a palace. So we must remember that Josephus is using an example, not what it actually was. He says it might seem. Again, this is just an example. If he was speaking literally, then the current Temple Mount that some claim was the Antonia fortress wouldn't have fit this description either, because it was no way the size of several cities. According to leading archaeologists, it's very likely the Romans also had an encampment of soldiers by the Antonia fortress. This could have been what Josephus was referring to as well. It is also claimed that a Roman legion was stationed at the Antonia fortress because Josephus appears to use the word legion in one of his quotes. He talks about this Roman fort and says that there always lay in this tower, and he uses the word tagma, which is a Greek word. It must be understood that the original writings of Josephus were in Greek. Today, the English versions we have of Josephus are translations. The Greek word Josephus used, that some have translated as legion, is tagma. This translation is very debatable, and other translations of Josephus use the word cohort. Josephus uses the Greek word tagma for a unit, not necessarily a legion. In the Byzantine period, a tagma was a military unit of around 200 to 400 men. Josephus calls the Sadducees a tagma or an order, and he also called the Essenes a tagma. So tagma was also used as an order or a unit of people. In secular Greek usage, tagma means battalion, that which has been arranged, thing placed in order, a body of soldiers, a corps, band, troops, class, and so forth. It is used in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians 15:23, but each in its own order. Christ the first fruits, then after those who are Christ at his coming. So to say that tagma definitely was a legion is to take the word far beyond how it was used in many other places. So as we've seen, all of the evidence supports that the Temple Mount existed long before the Romans arrived. There was never a Roman legion in Jerusalem from the time of Christ until 66 AD. So to base that there was a legion on the Temple Mount based upon one word, that is debatable and translated many other ways, and most of them as a unit or as an order or as a cohort, is truly irresponsible. Now let's look at a couple quotes by Josephus that state the Antonia fortress or the Roman fort was totally destroyed, even to the digging up of its foundations. Josephus says, "Now Titus gave orders to his soldiers that were with him to dig up the foundations of the tower of Antonia and make him a ready passage for his army to come up." Then in another quote he says, "In the meantime, the rest of the Roman army had in 7 days' time overthrown the foundations of the tower of Antonia and had made ready a broad way to the temple." What we see here is that Josephus records that the Romans destroyed the Antonia fortress even to digging up its foundations. This means total destruction. After digging up the foundations of the Antonia fortress in 7 days, they then entered on the Temple Mount platform to destroy the temple. Now, if the Antonia fortress was totally destroyed, then how can those who claim the current Temple Mount was the Antonia fortress? According to Josephus, the Antonia fortress ceased to exist. The Temple Mount still exists today, so it's impossible it was the Antonia fortress. Now let's look at a brief history of the Antonia fortress, which will provide more evidence it was not located where the Temple Mount is. When the Greeks conquered the land, they identified the structure as key to the defense of the city. Later, the Hasmoneans, in around 140 BC, referred to it as the Baris or Baris. During the reign of Herod the Great, the Baris was completely re-engineered. In 35 BC, Herod built the Antonia fortress, which he named after his friend Mark Antony, in the very spot where the Baris or the Hasmonean fortress once stood. Therefore, it should be noted that the Antonia fortress existed long before the Romans arrived. Herod just rebuilt what already existed in the exact same location. So to say the Romans or Herod the Great built the Antonia fortress on the Temple Mount is extremely inaccurate. As noted earlier, evidence for the Antonia fortress and its existence can be seen today in the northwest corner of the Temple Mount, exactly where Josephus said it existed. We can see the bedrock upon which it existed, according to Josephus, and we can see holes in the walls that once supported a portico along it. Now let's look at some verses from the Bible that make it extremely clear that the original temples were not located in the city of David, as some would say. And if we would only let Scripture and God be our authority, it would clear up this whole matter quickly. God says that Solomon built the temple on the threshing floor of Araunah or Ornan that his father David purchased. This threshing floor was on Mount Moriah. 2 Chronicles 3:1-2 say, Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah was north of the city of David, where the Lord had appeared to his father David, at the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. He began to build on the second day in the second month of the 4th year of his reign. After Solomon built the temple, then he would bring up the Ark of the Covenant out of the city of David to the temple on Mount Moriah. 2 Chronicles 5:2 states, Then Solomon assembled to Jerusalem the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the fathers' households of the sons of Israel, to bring up the ark, notice, bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. So the ark was brought up out of the city of David. Then from this point on, the Ark of the Covenant would reside permanently in the temple that Solomon built, which is also referred to as the house of the Lord. In 2 Chronicles 6:10-11, Solomon states, Now the Lord has fulfilled his word which he spoke, for I have risen in the place of my father David and sit on the throne of Israel, as the Lord promised, and have built the house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. There I have placed the ark in which is the covenant of the Lord, which he made with the sons of Israel. These verses clearly state that the Ark of the Covenant was brought out of the city of David to be placed permanently in the house of the Lord that Solomon built on Mount Moriah. So, if the ark was brought out of the city of David to the temple, then the temple could not have been in the city of David. This is very, very clear. Now, some interpret these verses to mean that Solomon just took the Ark of the Covenant out of the city of David for a parade-type event and then placed it back in the city of David. Now, why would Solomon build a glorious temple and then put the ark back into the city of David? Plus, Scripture is clear that Solomon placed the ark in the new temple he had just built. Now, interpretations like these are truly twisted and misleading. Now, let's look at some other verses in the Bible that some would say support their claim that the current Temple Mount was the Antonia fortress and the original temples were in the city of David. They say that Jesus said, "Not one stone would be left upon another." So because there are stones left upon one another at the current Temple Mount, it couldn't be the location of the Temple Mount. They point commonly to the stones at the western wall as verification, and that those who believe otherwise are calling Jesus a liar or untrue. So let's look at this important issue. Christ's reference to not one stone being left upon another is found in 4 places in the Gospel. Let's look briefly at each one and see what they actually say. The first is Matthew 24, 1 and 2. It says, Jesus left the temple area and was going on his way when his disciples came to point out the temple buildings to him. But he responded and said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." We see here that he is talking about the temple buildings. That's what the disciples are talking about. Jesus responds to that question. Now the second passage is Mark 13, 1 and 2. It says, as he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, look, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you not see these?" What? Great buildings. Not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. So clearly, once again, Jesus is talking about the buildings on the Temple Mount platform. The third is Luke 21, 5 and 6. And while some were talking about the temple, that it was decorated with beautiful stones and vowed gifts, he said, "As for these things which you are observing, the days will come when there will not be left one stone upon another which will not be torn down." Once again, the central point is they are talking about the temple. So in all three of these passages, Jesus was referring to the stones of the buildings on the Temple Mount platform, not the Temple Mount platform itself. This was fulfilled in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed the buildings on the Temple Mount. Yet those who believe the current Temple Mount is the Antonia fortress try to convince us to believe that the retaining walls of the Temple Mount platform were part of the temple and the stones to which Jesus was referring. The temple stood on the foundation of the large retaining walls called the Temple Mount platform, and they were located well inside the walls themselves. So we have a Temple Mount platform that had retaining walls, and upon this Temple Mount platform is where the buildings of the temple stood. So they will say that because there are still stones, and of course they are referring to the Temple Mount platform, that it couldn't be the temple because there are still stones there. But once again, the stones are of the Temple Mount platform, not the temple itself. The claim is also made by some that there are no stones of the current Temple Mount that are not older than Herodian stones. This is clearly false. On the eastern wall, as we have already alluded to earlier in the video, by the eastern gate, there are clearly stones dating back to the time of Solomon, Hezekiah, Zerubbabel, and Nehemiah. So they are misleading and only use the western wall as an example. The current western wall expansion was begun by Herod in around 19 BC. So yes, these stones are from Herod, but the eastern wall, which is part of the Temple Mount platform retaining wall, has stones dating back to the time of Solomon. Now the fourth verse that is used about no stone being left upon another is found in Luke 19:41 and 44, and it refers to the whole city of Jerusalem being destroyed. So it says, "When he approached Jerusalem, he saw the city and wept over it." This is talking about the triumphal entry, saying, "If you had known on this day, even you, the conditions for peace, but now they have been hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will put up a barricade against you and surround you and hem you in on every side. And they will level you to the ground and throw down your children within you. And they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation." So here, Jesus is talking about the whole city of Jerusalem. So what did Christ mean by not one stone would be left upon another? Well, it was a common phrase used at that time to speak of utter destruction. What it didn't mean, and we'll show you this, is that nowhere in Jerusalem could there be one stone still upon another. And we see this evidenced all throughout Jerusalem in its ruins today. We see places all over Jerusalem where there are still stones upon another dating back to the time of its destruction. So there is just clearly evidence everywhere of one stone still upon another. So it was a phrase talking about utter destruction. So Christ talked in a figurative sense on occasions, and this was one of them. For example, it says in the Old Testament that the nation of Israel would come into the promised land flowing with milk and honey. Well, we know that the promised land didn't literally have milk and honey flowing in it. It was a phrase talking about prosperity and blessing. Also, Christ said to those who would be born again that out of their innermost being would flow rivers of living water. Well, we know that literally there are no rivers of living water flowing out of believers. So we have to understand that this phrase, when Jesus says, "Not one stone will be left upon another," was a phrase talking about utter destruction, which did happen. However, there were still stones down at the lower levels that were left upon one another. So we have to understand also how cities and buildings were destroyed that were made out of stones. When Jesus prophesied that not one stone would be left upon another, that was talking about the buildings on the temple. Some of the base of the Temple Mount platform was left intact because when the stones fell down, they reached an equilibrium, so the stones couldn't fall farther than what the ones that were already there. So they fell down, and that was underneath, that they fell down and covered, then that was preserved still intact. So just amazing to see these stones. Some of these stones are just absolutely massive in size, huge. Additionally, conquering armies would purposefully leave some walls standing as a living witness to their conquest. So this is what Jesus is talking about. Now, some who use this argument that one stone can't be left upon another turn right around and violate their own argument by claiming they have found walls and places in the city of David that supposedly supports their theory that the temple was in the city of David. So on one hand, they use the fact that some stones still remain upon one another in Jerusalem and around the Temple Mount to claim the temple couldn't be on the current Temple Mount, but then turn right around and use stones that are still standing upon one another in the city of David to supposedly support their claims. So they really can't have it both ways. They can't argue that no stone can be left upon another, but then turn right around and say, well, we're seeing things in the city of David because we're seeing stones that are still left upon one another. So their claims are very contradictory. So in summary, there are still stones upon one another all throughout the old city of Jerusalem. And we know this was the case because Jerusalem continued to be inhabited even after it was destroyed. So it was utterly destroyed, but yet it continued to be inhabited and rebuilt. To literally have dug every stone up in Jerusalem and spread it out, it would have taken miles and miles, kilometers and kilometers of space to spread all these stones out. So that's just not really realistic. Once again, the better interpretation is that it's a figurative statement talking about utter destruction, which did happen. So the prophecies of Christ that not one stone would be left upon another that referred to the temple and its buildings were literally fulfilled. However, the prophecy regarding not one stone left upon another that referred to the city of Jerusalem and its surroundings were figuratively fulfilled. Now let's talk about the need for water for the temple. Those who propose that the temple was in the city of David claim that the current location of the Temple Mount didn't have enough water for temple sacrifices, and especially enough living water. They assert that only the Gihon spring in the city of David had enough living water to supply the temple's needs. They also mention a spring that pours forth from under the Temple Mount, referred to in writings by Aristeas, Tacitus, and the Pilgrim of Bordeaux. So let's look at this important issue. Biblical law identifies only 3 instances in which purification is to be accomplished by the use of running water or living water. The first is defilement by a corpse, found in Numbers 19:17. 2, by a non-routine bodily discharge, referred to in Leviticus 15:11, or 3, by leprosy, found in Leviticus 14:5 and 50. In these instances, part of the purification process requires the use of water that flows continuously. In all other cases of defilement, purification is accomplished by washing in water without any requirement that it be running water or living water. For all other ritual cleansing, regular water was used, so there wasn't a huge need for living water for the temple's use. Nonetheless, we will see that there was an overabundance of living water and regular water on the current Temple Mount. For example, by the Temple Mount, there were other large pools with running water going through them. There were the pools of Bethesda to the north of the temple and the pool of Siloam to the south. Just these pools alone provided over 54 million gallons or 205 million liters of water, and these were continually flowing. Additionally, there were aqueducts from Bethlehem that ran to the Temple Mount that were in existence in at least 250 BC. This was long before the Romans arrived, and these supplied living water to the temple. Many archaeologists believe that the aqueducts even date back to the time of Solomon. So the facts are that it wasn't the Romans who initially built the aqueducts, and their purpose was for the current Temple Mount platform, and you can see today the remains of these aqueducts that led from Bethlehem to the current Temple Mount platform. So here we are. You can see the Jaffa Gate up here. We've hiked down here. We're going to be going to this amazing aqueduct that came from Bethlehem to the Temple Mount, believed to be built during the time of Solomon, and then renovated by Hezekiah, Josiah, the Hasmoneans, and Herod the Great. And it runs from right here. It would be going right along here. We're going to swing around. We're going to show you up here where it would have gone. Okay, we're going to hike up here. We're going to show you all this, but it runs right up here, right above this rock ledge here. Then we're going to show you right up here. So you can see this rock wall right here. That was part of what retained the aqueduct. And then we're going to hike up here above this wall right here that I'm pointing to, and we're going to show you in detail this aqueduct. So we're going to walk along here, and we're going to show you the remains of this aqueduct. So here you can see it running down along through here. It would be coming from up, going down, because obviously water doesn't run uphill. So here it is right along here, and you can see it very, very clearly. So once again, proof that the Temple Mount had a canal, an aqueduct, bringing water from Bethlehem, which is about 8 or 9 miles away, all the way to the Temple Mount. There were also more living water sources and regular water sources in Jerusalem in ancient times than just the Gihon Spring. For example, 2 Chronicles 32, 1-4 says this: After these acts of faithfulness, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and invaded Judah and besieged the fortified cities. This was talking about during the time of Hezekiah in around 700 BC. And intended to break into them for himself. Now when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come and that he intended to wage war against Jerusalem, he decided with his officers and his warriors to cut off the supply of water from, now note carefully, the springs, plural, which were outside the city, and they helped him. So many assembled and stopped up all the springs and the stream which flowed through the region, saying, Why should the kings of Assyria come and find what? Abundant water. What we see here is a lot of water in the old city Jerusalem. There was even a stream that appeared to run down the Kidron Valley. So there was plenty of both living and regular water around the current Temple Mount. Those who make the claim that the Gihon Spring was the only source of water by the Temple Mount simply haven't looked at what Scripture records. Now, as for regular water for the other defilement purposes and for ritual cleansing, there were massive cisterns on the Temple Mount, in fact, around 37. And these would hold, by conservative estimates, more than 10.5 million gallons or over 40 million liters of water. Many of these cisterns date to the time of Solomon, Hezekiah, and Zerubbabel. There are also around 16 cisterns that are in the original 500 cubit dimensions of the Temple Mount platform that Solomon built. All these water sources supplied more than enough water for the temple's use. There are also 50 or more mikvahs, and the plural form of mikvah is mikvaot, on the southern steps and on the west side of the Temple Mount. It is also helpful to mention that the temple existed at Shiloh for 369 years. This was during Joshua's time and beyond, and it did not have a water source close to it. The closest spring to the temple in Shiloh was about 1/2 mile or about 1 kilometer away. This shows that the temple was able to function perfectly without a nearby water source. In those days, water was just hauled and was very common to do so. Now, regarding the references by Aristeas, Tacitus, and the Pilgrim of Bordeaux, what they say about a spring and water on the Temple Mount doesn't really conflict with the archaeological evidence we find on the Temple Mount. In fact, there are other writings that do reference a spring on the Temple Mount. However, these writers also wrote about some things that are just not true and not factual. For example, Aristeas also said that the Jordan River flows into the Mediterranean Sea. This is certainly not the case. And Bordeaux said that the transfiguration of Christ took place on the Mount of Olives, and that the water from the Gihon spring stopped running on the Sabbath, and more. Often what they wrote about was second and third hand knowledge. What they said wasn't infallible, and we should look at the evidence instead of taking what they said as the gospel, because much of what they said, bless their hearts, just wasn't factual. So in summary, there was an abundance of both living and regular water available for the temple use on the current Temple Mount. Also, we see that many of these cisterns date back to the time of Solomon that are located on the Temple Mount platform. This once again confirms that the Temple Mount existed long before the Romans arrived. Now let's talk about the possibility that the Jews forgot where their temple was located over time. There's a theme that those who believe the temple was in the city of David and the current Temple Mount was a Roman fort continually use. They say the Jews forgot where the temple was located. So phrases like uncovering Jerusalem's lost temple, the temple lost in time, Jerusalem and the lost temple of the Jews, the temples that Jerusalem forgot, the lost Temple Mount, and more are continually used. Now these statements truly reflect a serious lack of understanding of the Jewish culture, their writings, oral traditions, historical and archaeological facts, and the continual presence that the Jews had in Jerusalem. Here are the facts that debunk this myth. The Jews, while in exile in Babylon, sang this song from Psalm 137, 5 and 6. If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill, may my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth, if I do not remember you, if I do not exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy. So the Jews would not have forgotten where their temple was. They were commanded not to, and if they did so, they were agreeing to a curse upon themselves. The temple was the center of the universe for the Jews. It's where God resided. It's where they met with the divine. It was their whole center of existence and purpose in life. So they did not forget where it was at. They were also always directed to pray towards Jerusalem wherever they were located. So once again, Jerusalem and the temple were the center of their life. All Jewish synagogues in Israel and around the world always pointed to Jerusalem, where? To the Temple Mount, because that's where the temple resided. In around 132 AD, this was after Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, the Roman Emperor Hadrian built a temple to Jupiter on the site of the original temple on the Temple Mount. This has been verified with archaeology. This temple was then torn down by the Byzantine Christians in around 324 AD. As mentioned earlier in this video, the Muslims built the Dome of the Rock over the exact place the temple stood based on overwhelming evidence provided to them. And then from then on, the Dome of the Rock has stood on this very site. So what we have is an unbroken chain of temples, churches, and the Dome of the Rock being located on the current Temple Mount platform. Additionally, the Jews kept extremely strict records, both orally and written, of their history and the temple location. They can be found in the Mishnah and Talmud. These works are basically encyclopedias in volume and size. They are massive, and they provide clear details about the Jews' history and the temple and its location. The Jews take great pride in their knowledge of history, and they are students of it. So they did not forget where the temple was. To say that the temple location was somehow lost over time is woefully untrue and reflects a massive flaw in those who claim otherwise of their knowledge of the Jews and their history. A simple Google search will reveal there has always been a Jewish presence in Jerusalem, so they did not somehow forget where their temple was. Today, there is no reputable Jew who thinks the original temple was in the city of David. They know exactly where it is, and it's where the Dome of the Rock stands today. So it's just virtually impossible that the Jews would forget where their most sacred and holy site was located, which was the center of their life, it was their meaning, and it was their significance. It was everything to them because it was where God resided and where they met with Him. They did not forget where it was. For those who say otherwise, truly reveals a lack of their knowledge of the Jews, their history, and how important the temple was to them. The temple was not lost over time. Now let's talk about the use of the word Zion in Scripture, as some claim that Zion is referred to as God's dwelling place. Therefore, the temple is in Zion because Zion is referred to as the city of David. Now let's look at what Scripture says about this issue and discover if the terms Zion and Mount Zion always refer to just the city of David. The word Zion is used around 178 times in the Bible. As we will see, it has many more uses than just the city of David. In the beginning, the city of David is referred to as Zion. 2 Samuel 5:7 says, "Nevertheless, David captured the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David." However, as the city grew and Solomon built a new temple, God referred to the new area as Zion as well, and especially as Mount Zion. This is because the new temple was built above the city of David to the north. Psalm 48:1 and 2 say, "Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, His holy mountain. Beautiful in elevation, the joy of the whole earth, is Mount Zion in the far north, the city of the great King." So here we have some descriptors. We have that it's a high mountain, it's a holy mountain, it's beautiful in elevation, and it's in the north. This perfectly describes where Solomon built the temple to the north of the city of David, on the Temple Mount, which was Mount Moriah. Isaiah 2:2 says, "Now it will come about that in the last days the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains, and will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it." Once again, this would describe the Temple Mount, which is Mount Moriah. At this time in Israel's history, the Temple Mount, upon which Solomon built the temple, would be referred to as a holy mountain. The city of David certainly wasn't a mountain. It was down below and not that high at all. In Zephaniah 3:14 we see that the nation of Israel is referred to as Zion. It says, "Sing aloud, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O Israel. Rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem." So here the nation of Israel is referred to as the daughter of Zion and as Israel. Psalm 126:1 says, "When the Lord brought back the captivity of Zion, we were like those who dream." So here, the captivity of Zion will be talking about the nation of Israel. And then in Psalm 146:10 it says, "The Lord shall reign forever. Your God, O Zion," referring to the Israelites, "to all generations praise the Lord." So here we see that Zion once again refers to also as the people of Israel. The word Zion can also refer to the land of Israel. Psalm 133:3 says, "It is like the dew of Hermon, descending upon the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord commanded the blessing, life forevermore." So here we see that mountains of Zion, this is referring to the land of Israel. Now I could go on for many verses, but I think you get the idea. So in summary, the references to Zion are not just referring to the original city of David, as some claim. It had many more uses. It referred to all of Jerusalem as it expanded, to the people of Israel, to the land of Israel, and more. Those who claim otherwise are just not looking at the whole of Scripture, but selecting a few texts to support their theory. This is very poor handling of God's Word and therefore is misleading information. Now let's look at another piece of convincing evidence that supports the current Temple Mount as the true location of the original temples and not as a Roman fort as some claim. Roman forts had 4 gates. The Temple Mount has at least 8 and maybe 9. The shape of Roman forts were generally square or somewhat rectangular. The Temple Mount is shaped like a trapezoid. Roman forts had rounded corners. The Temple Mount has square corners. Plus, the Temple Mount had no rampart, ditch, or moat like Roman forts. Plus, the gates of the Temple Mount are very irregular. For example, on the south side there are 2 gates. On the west side, 4 gates. On the north side, 1 gate, plus the access from the Antonia fortress. On the east side, at least 1 gate, and some believe possibly 2. So in total, the Temple Mount had at least 8 gates and maybe 9. Roman forts only had 4 gates, 1 on each side. However, there is one entrance to the Temple Mount that provides powerful evidence that it was the true Temple Mount and not a Roman fort. It is the southern stair entrance. Well, here we are on the southern stairs going up to the southern side of the temple. And these stones right here that I'm going to show you, the ones that are cut into the bedrock, those are the original stones. So I'm going to walk up here and show you these original stones. You can see right here, this is original. These are original right here. These are original, and then these have been put in later in recent years. But this right here, all of these are the original stones. When Herod the Great enlarged the Temple Mount, he designed the stairs in such a way that worshipers entering had to do so in a contemplative, worshipful manner. To accomplish this, he purposefully made the steps uneven. You can see this in the design here of the stairs. Now, certainly Romans wouldn't have anything like this leading up to their Roman fort. Their steps were always even and consistent. Now, the Temple Mount we see today even fulfills a Bible prophecy found in Micah 3:12. Zion will be plowed like a field, Jerusalem will become a heap of rubble, the Temple Hill a mound overgrown with thickets. We can even see a modern-day photo of the Temple Mount being plowed like a field. And certainly, after Jerusalem's destruction in 70 and 132 AD, this verse was even more clearly fulfilled. Now let's look at the last big question. Could the Temple Mount actually fit in the city of David? Now, to begin with, there is no archaeologist that believes the temple was located in the city of David. In fact, all the leading archaeologists have spoken out against this theory. Among them is Dr. Scott Stripling. Let's hear briefly what he says.
Every week I'm asked by someone, so what do you think about the new theory that archaeologists have that the temple wasn't on the Temple Mount? And I immediately respond, there's not a single archaeologist who believes that. You've got people who are claiming that, but there's no archaeologists that would do that because the evidence is overwhelming that it was. But out there in Christendom, there are many people who have been exposed to this, so I appreciate the opportunity to address it.
Also, some have quoted Eli Shukron, one of the most famous and knowledgeable archaeologists in Israel, as stating he believes the temple was in the city of David. This is completely opposite of the truth. Recently, I ran into Eli in Jerusalem and asked him in his own words to clarify this twisting of his words. So just so we know, Eli is a very, very famous archaeologist. He's one of the most significant archaeologists in Jerusalem, so we wanted to get it from Eli's.
Again, the temple on Temple Mount, period. All the other is just idea for people, and we're in the world, everyone can say whatever they want, but if you go to the evidence, archaeology evidence, archaeology finding the temple on Temple Mount, period.
Great.
Okay?
Thank you.
God
bless you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Now, those who claim the temple was in the city of David say the Temple Mount platform measured 600 by 600 feet or 183 by 183 meters. However, in the Mishnah in Medot 2.1, it says the original Temple Mount measured 500 square cubits or 861 feet by 861 feet or 262 by 262 meters. And this fits the evidence exactly that we presented earlier in this video. So in order to make the Temple Mount fit their theory, they make it very small. They do this because the city of David is tiny in size and is only 12 to 14 acres or 7 hectares in size. The current Temple Mount is 35 acres or 17 hectares in size. When we really understand how small the city of David is, it becomes very clear that a large Temple Mount would not be able to fit there. Just the topography of the land reveals this. Now we know that the Temple Mount was expanded by the Hasmoneans in around 140 BC. Then later, Josephus says that Herod then doubled the already expanded size of the Temple Mount platform. The Hasmoneans expanded even more. As we have already seen in this video, we can see the clear evidence of these expansions on the current Temple Mount platform. Now, even though this proposed small Temple Mount goes against the best archaeological and historical evidence, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt and use their own Temple Mount size. Nonetheless, when this size is superimposed onto the city of David, huge problems arise. And when you use what is the correct size, according to the best evidence, monumental problems surface. It just has a hard time fitting somewhere where previous ruins that existed at the same time can be found. We'll show you both in this next part of the video. Additionally, as you can see, it would have had to extend way out into the Kidron Valley, which wouldn't have happened. So where would it fit? Let's look at 6 options. 1. Could the Temple Mount fit on the Ophel? Now the Ophel is the space between the city of David and the Temple Mount. Well, it couldn't have been here because the ruins date back to the time of Solomon up to the time of Christ. So there were buildings that existed here so that it couldn't have been located here. Also, Nehemiah 11:21 states that when he repaired the walls of Jerusalem, the temple servants lived on the Ophel, he says. But the temple servants were living in the Ophel, and Ziha and Gishba were in charge of the temple servants. So the Bible clearly reveals that the temple servants lived here, so it couldn't have been on the Ophel. 2. Could it have fit in the upper part of the city of David? In the upper part of the city is where King David's palace was. This has been excavated thoroughly, and virtually all archaeologists affirm this, as the ruins date to the time of King David and fit exactly what his palace would have looked like. So again, there were already buildings here, so the Temple Mount can't be placed here. But even if it could, the city of David is a small ridge plateau. On either side of it were steep, deep drop-offs. In order to build a temple platform that could fill in these deep valleys, it would have required immense work and engineering. In fact, when Herod the Great expanded the current Temple Mount, he put large columns with arches on the inside to hold up the floor. He didn't use earth because it would have been too heavy and pushed out the walls. So the height of Herod's walls wouldn't even compare to what they would have to be if the Temple Mount was in the city of David. Number 3, what about the Temple Mount being over the Givati parking lot excavations? These ruins date back to the time of Christ and later, so you can't have a temple where buildings already existed. This is the major problem with locating the temple in the city of David. There just aren't any vacant spaces available that don't have ruins dating back to the time of Christ and beyond. Number 4, would it fit over the Gihon Spring? It's amazing how some who propose the temple was in the city of David do so based upon their belief that the Gihon Spring gushed up from under the ground onto the Temple Mount. Yet when you look at their drawings, they don't place the temple there, but toward the upper part of the city of David. Nonetheless, the major problem still exists of building retaining walls strong enough to fill in the massive depth of the Kidron Valley. You can see here how deep the Kidron Valley is and how much of a massive task it would have been to fill it in. Also, the Kidron Valley is a drainage area where water runs during the rainy seasons and flooding periods. This isn't so much today because of drainage management, but in biblical times there was a stream that flowed here. There is no way the Jews would have built a Temple Mount into the Kidron Valley and blocked off the flow of the water in it and formed a dam that would have damaged the Temple Mount base platform. However, some of those who propose the temple was built in this area do just that. For those who haven't been to Jerusalem, it might seem like those who proposed the temple was in the city of David that it seems reasonable because anyone can draw pictures and make it look good. However, when you walk the terrain of the city of David and the Kidron Valley, you can see why their theory just doesn't make sense. The topography of the land just prohibits it. Their theory looks good in drawings and might seem convincing, but when you actually look at the reality of their theory and superimpose even their proposed small temple size onto the city of David, their theory crashes down. And when you superimpose the more reliable size, it's just an impossibility. But it's also impossible the Temple Mount could be located over the Gihon Spring because large trash dumps dating back to the time of Christ and later have been uncovered by the Gihon Spring in the city of David. Let's hear what Dr. Scott Stripling says about this.
Scott, it is not physically possible. And proposal 1, the original Martin proposal, was that it was over the Gihon Spring. Now, that would be more consistent with their arguments from Aristeas and so forth that you have to have a spring. But the second proposal that Kornuk advocates doesn't even have it over the Gihon Spring. Well, the problem with placing a temple over the Gihon Spring in the Second Temple period is that there was a garbage dump 70 meters deep that had accumulated there over a couple of hundred years. How could you possibly get 70 meters of garbage underneath the temple if the temple was standing there? So it is an impossibility. So just this one fact alone should cause a fair-minded person to reconsider his or her position.
Number 5, would it fit below the Gihon spring toward the pool of Siloam? Again, the answer is no. The tombs of David are located there, among other ruins dating back to the time of David and up to the time of Christ. You can't just place a building on something that was already there. Number 6, would it fit over the ritual temple located by the Gihon spring? Some look at an ancient ritual place by the Gihon spring, which is believed to be the temple of Melchizedek, as evidence for the original temple being there. Well, here we are at a very, very unique place. Right here and right behind me underneath is a big, huge cavern that has been discovered that is believed to be Melchizedek's temple. However, these ruins are very small and date to a time before Solomon. Additionally, most of those who use this evidence don't even place their proposed temples over this site. Also, it's located almost at the bottom of the valley, so the mountains on both sides would have had to be removed to have a Temple Mount platform down this low. There is certainly no evidence of this. And as we have seen, mass trash dumps were nearby, which reveal the temple couldn't have been here either. It should be mentioned that the city of David has been the most excavated site in Israel for the past 150 years, and there has been no evidence suggesting the original Temple Mount platform or temple were here, but just the contrary. What we do find in the city of David is more evidence the temple resided on the current Temple Mount. There has been discovered a major road called the Pilgrim's Road that led from the Pool of Siloam, which was a large mikveh, up to the southwest corner of the current Temple Mount that had stores and shops along the way. This reveals the Jews would cleanse themselves in the Pool of Siloam and then make their way up to the Temple Mount platform and the temple located on it. There is also a major problem the new theorists have with a very small Temple Mount platform of just 600 by 600 feet or 183 by 183 meters. They fail to take into consideration the needed space for the hundreds of thousands and even millions of Jews who would visit Jerusalem and the Temple Mount during the major feast weeks. There is no way a tiny Temple Mount could accommodate these massive crowds. Also, we know that the early church grew rapidly, and within a short time, 8,000 believers were meeting on or around the Temple Mount. So a small Temple Mount platform just overlooks these facts. The current Temple Mount platform is massive in size and was the place that could have handled these large crowds. Now, we have given the new theorists the benefit of the doubt and used their own proposed Temple Mount platform size. However, if we use the more reliable source of the Mishnah size, then expanded by the Hasmoneans and then doubled in size by Herod the Great, we get a space exactly the size of the current Temple Mount platform. And this is according to the historical and archaeological evidence. When we superimpose this size onto the city of David, as you can see, we have massive problems. So in summary, here are 4 closing thoughts. 1, because this is such an important issue, I spent around 2 years of intensive research on it. I lead teams to Israel, I have written books, so I need to know the truth. What I have presented are the major evidences supporting the temple being on the current Temple Mount. There is much more evidence that I could present, but this seems enough for now. 2, this new proposed theory is very young. only dating back to around 1999. This in and of itself is problematic. If this new theory was viable, it would have surfaced long ago. The fact that no archaeologist believes in it is significant weight against it. 3. Now, while those who propose this new theory might have noble intentions and sound convincing, the evidence just doesn't support their theory. 4. I will end with this Bible verse from Proverbs 18:17. The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. What we have done is provide an in-depth examination of this new theory, and we believe when it's brought under the microscopic lens of the evidence that it is just very lacking. Well, thank you for watching this video, and may God richly bless you.